Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's program, History at High Noon, December 1941, North Carolina Response to Pearl Harbor. My name is Stacey and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. We're so glad that you're joining us for today's virtual lunchtime lecture program. If you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at ncmuseumofhistory.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming programs, exhibits, and digital resources. This is also where you can find more information about shopping in our wonderful museum shop and joining our North Carolina Museum of History Associates. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which in addition to many other things, helps make programs like today's program possible. We would also like to thank those of you who kindly donated funds towards today's program. We do our best to keep our programs free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping these series going, and we just continue to be so appreciative of your generous support of the museum. A few quick housekeeping tips for today. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the program, and to please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of our talk, our intern Bobby will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Matthew Peak, Military Collection Archivist for the State Archives of North Carolina. Matthew is a native of Northeast Ohio, though his family has roots in Kentucky and North Carolina. He holds a BA in History from Kentucky Christian University and an MA in Public History from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Peak has worked and volunteered for a number of city, county, state, and corporate archives and historical societies, including the Montana Historical Society and the Kentucky Historical Society. He began working in November 2014 as the new Military Collections Archivist for the State Archives of North Carolina. The goal of the Military Collection is to collect original archival materials and oral history interviews that document the military service of North Carolina veterans, North Carolina military installations, and those on the home front during war times. Peak is the author and editor for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources military history blog, North Carolina Stories of Service, which uses original materials to tell the stories of our state's veterans and the state's wartime experiences. Matthew, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, and hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to share my presentation. Let's see, go back. Okay, and for today, what I want to do is really focus on the experiences that North Carolinians had in the war, not just those who were stationed there, but those on the home front. And we're going to be using original materials, some of which you've never seen or have never been put online, from collections such as the North Carolina Office of Civilian Defense Records, which are we collected during World War II and are part of the World War II papers in the military collection. Anybody can access these things, but we wanted to share some of these examples. So there's a lot to get through. There's text on here I'm not going to go over completely. You can read as I go, and we can make the PowerPoint available to anybody interested after the program is completed. So a little bit about North Carolina militarily before Pearl Harbor happened. Some of the things that people don't know necessarily about, one that is more regularly known is the Carolina maneuvers that happened, the U.S. Army maneuvers of the fall of 1941 in October and November of 1941. It's the largest military exercises in the country up to that point. It was an effort to test existing and emerging capabilities and equipment by the military. It brought huge crowds of civilians out in North and South Carolina to watch these events on public roads. And here you see a photograph taken by one of those, a young woman of a 36th Field Artillery Regiment Jeep driving on a road in North Carolina, and then a poster for a recreation center is being put up in Wadesboro for this program. Here's a map of the Carolina maneuver area that you can see the border area, and then the circle areas are where the military had their headquarter regions. So these are some of the strength of military units stationed in North Carolina. North Carolina military installations really didn't start growing until World War II. Camp Davis started construction in December 1940, but not all the facilities were finished by Pearl Harbor. But here are some of the units that were stationed there and the number. And then Fort Bragg was mostly a field artillery training ground by the time Pearl Harbor began, and they had not yet started huge expansion of the facilities there. They were building barracks at the time, but they weren't completed when Pearl Harbor began. And then also the operation of the federal draft. The draft had started in 1940, and then Congress had enacted a law in September 1940, but it limited the number of men and women who could join to 1 million prior to 1942. One of the biggest challenges was what to do with African-American men. Few of them were allowed to be drafted because there were fewer facilities to train them. They had to be segregated per the racial politics at the time. And even though men came out and registered for the draft, they weren't allowed to be inducted at the numbers that otherwise they could have been. And due to segregation, there were fewer of these facilities around. Some of the African Americans were denied acceptance in 1941, and we have letters and documents showing that they were then called back again as the standards and draft quotas were changed. Draft evasion, which is always an issue during drafts in the United States. In our history, draft evasion started. People wouldn't respond to local draft board notices or surveys that local draft boards sent out. We have some of these records. And as you see, an article from the Federal Bureau of Investigation doing investigations nationwide that was published in the Marion Progress from Marion, North Carolina. So I also have stats for the differences in the numbers for federal induction of military personnel based on the draft from 40 to 42. So you can see the difference pre and post Pearl Harbor. 1940, there were just over 18,000 people drafted. In 1941, there were over 923,000. And then once Pearl Harbor happened in 1942, there were over 3 million people that were drafted for service. Here are some of the actual induction records, draft records for Martin County. On the left, you see the local draft registrants list, where you can see African Americans and white individuals who have registered. And then on the right, you see a list of the smaller number of people who were actually sent on August 6, 1941 from Williamston to be inducted at Fort Bragg. This is a map that was published in the High Point Enterprise newspaper from High Point, North Carolina, showing the United States plan and strategy to try to keep the Japanese from attacking the west coast of the United States. And the rings showed the different areas that the Allies and the Japanese could attack from with their ships and their aircraft from different base locations. And in the center, you can see the Hawaiian Islands and the island of Midway and the strategic significance that those played. This is what people thought was going to happen as the Japanese would try to expand as of this article coming out in August 1941. So before Pearl Harbor, there were 7 U.S. Pacific Fleet, or there were 9 battleships, the U.S. Pacific Fleet numbers, that were tied up at Battleship Row. You can see here on the map of Ford Island Naval Air Station at Pearl Harbor. You can see the Arizona and the Oklahoma's locations. There were naval aircraft at 3 Naval and Marine Corps air stations around Pearl Harbor. U.S. Army Air Corps, which is what the Army Air Forces that later became that were called up to 1942. Their aircraft were parked in groups for defense against possible sabotage around Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Bellows Field. And then the U.S. Army members were billeted at Schofield Barracks. Just to give you an idea of the facilities, as you'll see these names come up later. As of December 1941, there were around 50,000 military personnel in the U.S. Armed Forces who were stationed at Pearl Harbor. And then for the attack itself, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. The attack from the National World War II Museum, it took about an hour and 15 minutes. There were 3,581 casualties to U.S. personnel, including civilians, killed over 2,403 individuals, and wounded around over 1,100 individuals. This is the telegram from the Naval Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet announcing the Japanese attack on December 7th from the Library of Congress. So you can see air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill, which a lot of people thought it was. So what follows are 6 pages. We're going to show lists of names of North Carolinians who were either killed or survived, with little bits of information about where they're from and what branches they served in, if we know. There are no compiled lists for North Carolinians stationed at Pearl Harbor. The Armed Forces doesn't necessarily care about listing states for military service. What they care about is ranks and units. So it's hard. We get a lot of people asking, do we have lists such as this, or lists of North Carolinians who were killed in World War II? We don't, because they weren't compiled in this manner. But For Pearl Harbor, what I did in doing the research for this program was found period newspaper articles, our archival collections, oral histories that we have in our Veterans Oral History collection at the State Archives, and present day newspaper articles reporting North Carolinians who were from North Carolina at the time they entered service during Pearl Harbor, before Pearl Harbor. So this isn't people who are Pearl Harbor survivors who are currently living in the state, but not from the state. We're trying to document this very close to where they were from at the time of battle. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play a 4.5-minute oral history audio segment from Douglas and Lena Eaker. Douglas was from Maiden, North Carolina, and it describes the morning of the attack, how they found out about it, what he did, and how his wife also responded to the news. This is an oral history interview that was recently digitized through a partnership with the North Carolina Museum of History and the Department of Defense for a grant. So we wanted to share some of this audio. I'm going to play this and I'm going to sit on these pages as we go. If Stacy, if you can put that list of these names in our chat box as a PDF, so you can read the names if you need to have it in front of you or have it to go through slower to take in all the names and information. We want to do that for you, but I'm going to slowly roll through these pages so you get a chance. And at the end, there's going to be a page of the 13 North Carolinians that we know were killed aboard the USS Arizona.
Moving forward now to December, were you on shift or were you off shift when it happened?
I was in the submarine base. I'm stationed at the submarine base. And I went home on Saturday night, the 6th of December, and I had got off in the evening watch at 4 to 12 and went to bed. And when Lena May woke me up the next morning, December the 7th, and said, "Honey, there's something happening in the yard." And I raised up out of the bed and looked, and I said, "Oh, it ain't nothing but a fire, go back to sleep." And she says, "No," said, "there's something," and I heard this, a big bang. And I jumped out of the bed, and I don't know what made me run to the back of the house. But I ran to the back of the house and looked out the bathroom window, and here come this flaming ball flying by. And I told her, I says, "Get downstairs and get under something, the damn Japs are here."
How did you know for sure?
I knew that they're damn Japs. I saw their planes before.
And when you say before, you mean when you were in Shanghai?
When I was on the USS Augusta, I saw them.
Yes, sir. Oh, so did you do what he said?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
And the first thing I did was turn on the radio, and there was silence, and then somebody came on and saying all military personnel report to your duty stations immediately. And they repeated that, and then they would go silent. Then it would come on again, you know. There was nothing on the radio except that.
I am
what
sitting here with
happened?
chill bumps.
Yeah.
What happened was that they didn't want to stay on the air too long for the Japs to get a radio fix on it. So they came on and announced it and get off again.
So
And,
you went to your duty station?
Yes, I went
Immediately.
next door to my neighbor and told him, I said, "Get out of the bed, you're gonna get bombed in it, the damn Japs are here."
Did
He
you even
said,
put on
"No."
your uniform, or did
Oh,
you?
yeah.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
put your uniform
And I
on?
had my whites on. We wore whites in Honolulu, in Hawaii. And I had on whites when I went to work. And I reported in at the sub base. And they ordered me to immediately set up radio on the USS Widgeon, emergency radio for the sub base. As soon as I did, the Widgeon pulled away from the dock and went right over beside the Arizona. And the skipper saw heavy oil coming out of the Arizona. And he said, pull away emergency. And we pulled away and got about 100 yards, maybe a little more, away from the Arizona when she blew. And we pulled over beside the Oklahoma, which was turned over on her side. And the crew of the Widgeon, and God bless them, they deserve everything they can get. And the crew of the Widgeon cut 14 men out of the bottom of the Oklahoma. I was just a radio. I wasn't attached to the Widgeon at all. I was there on an order from the sub base.
Yes.
And I was not a crew of the Widgeon. I was just an emergency radio.
Yes.
And one of the fellows came around and shooting the Jap plane, pow, with a rifle, pow. I said, give me that damn gun, I'll shoot and you load. And we were shooting at one when he went down. I hope and pray to God we got him. And we'll never know.
So I thought it was important to play that as he discusses being present for the Arizona as explosion, as so many of us have heard over the years, and many of us have probably visited the Arizona site. And here's the list of those that we know, compiled by the USS Arizona Association, Reunion Association by state, and we thank them for doing this for us. So here are some of the headlines from North Carolina newspapers from December 7th and December 8th. This is the Durham Herald Sun to give you an idea of what people were reading. And it's important to know a lot of the news that was spreading in North Carolina at the time was only by radio newspapers. Obviously, there was no cell phones. Telephone was expensive to call long distance. And you had to be connected by operators, and the phones were jammed in many parts of the country as people were calling during emergency crises of Pearl Harbor, similar to what we had on September 11th when the cell phone towers died. A lot of local operating stations were overloaded. Here's the Daily Independent from Kannapolis.
Matthew, I think you need to start sharing your screen again.
We're having technical issues. I'm going to go back because I think it's important. So we'll show some of the names and we'll just go a little bit long. Sorry, there was a technical issue trying to play the audio with the presentation. And Stacey, can you put that list in the chat box?
Yeah, so the PDF didn't load, so I've literally copy and pasted all their names into the chat. So
Okay.
I apologize, everybody.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody. We have published this list on the NC Stories of Service blog yesterday, so you can type in Google and find that. Some of the people, and some of these have recently been identified. Their remains have been identified by the War Department, the Department of Defense. Harley Jolly, who is the famous Mars Hill College history professor, passed away in November of 2020 during the pandemic. So unfortunately, we weren't able to commemorate his life as much, but he was at Hickam Field during the attack. There were a pair of brothers, Stanley and Bernice McLeod, who were both at Pearl Harbor. One was killed at Hickam Field, the other died. Pearl Harbor was really a tragedy in how many people were connected by what went on at this one location in North Carolina. And Edward Talbot, whose remains were just identified in August of this year, and he was recently interred in November. And then the Arizona, here is the list of the Arizona people who passed away from North Carolina. Again, I'm sorry for the technical issues there. So this is the Durham Herald Sun cover, as talked about earlier. Here's the Daily Independent from Kannapolis. Here's the Wilson Daily Times from Wilson, North Carolina. And these were all extra special editions published in the afternoon and evening on December 7th to get the news out, as many places only had a once-a-day newspaper, even though there were still some community newspapers doing a morning and evening edition of the newspaper. And then this is the cover of the Robeson from Lumberton, North Carolina on December 8th, when the US declares war on Japan. So I want to focus on one North Carolinian who was there. This is a collection that I brought in, and this gentleman's really important to me personally. Weldon C. Burleson of Yancey County, who lived in Burnsville, North Carolina. He was raised in Yancey County, attended high school in Burnsville. He served in the Marine Corps from 1934 to 1938. Then he re-enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps, which was kind of unusual to do, serving 2 different branches before World War II started. He is listed on Yancey County's Veterans Memorial as Weldon Burleson with an E. So a lot of people haven't made this connection, as his name's listed in official Pearl Harbor Day stuff with an I and other sources. Before the Pearl Harbor, he corresponded with friends and family, including a childhood friend, Elsie Edwards, who was living in Skillman, New Jersey at the time, but she was from Yancey County. And the two wrote each other. Elsie had friends of hers write letters to him, female friends, at his request. Burleson called her Chick or Chickie, and Elsie called him Snook in her letters. And then he was at Pearl Harbor at Hickam Field when the Japanese attacked. He was the first reported war casualty in World War II from Western North Carolina, according to the papers of the time. He was one of the first reported North Carolina casualties of the Pearl Harbor attack, and these are clippings that are in his collection. This is the only known photo that we have of him, printed in the newspaper article. The clipping at the left discusses how the family was notified and found out about his death. And this letter is from Elsie Edwards, written to Weldon Burleson the day after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 8th, 1941. And many letters such as this went out to service people who were stationed there from loved ones back home, not knowing if they survived. Mail would be delayed, as there was a huge issue with getting mail to Pearl Harbor after the attack by Japan. And some of these letters took 2 to 3 months to get returned back to their loved ones if the person had passed away during the attack. But this is the opening line of the letter. Of course, I have a million things on my mind these days. Right now, the uppermost thought is, I wonder if Snook is safe, if he's really all right. This declaration of war has hit the whole nation just as quickly as the bomb that struck Pearl Harbor. And one of the sadder elements of mail is what was marked on it for those who were deceased during World War II. Now, this is the original envelope that letter came in. And you can see the path that it took as she mailed this letter to him stationed at Barking Sands, which was an airfield he was working for the Army Air Corps to construct. And he was no longer there. He had gotten moved over to Hickam Field. They did not find him there. They forwarded him to the wrong unit, as you can see written on the envelope. Then they forwarded him to Hickam Field. He was stamped as being undeliverable and then written in pink red grease pen, deceased, on the cover. And on the back of the envelope is Elsie's handwriting when she received this envelope back. Now, she had learned about his death by December 11th or 12th. The family had contacted her from North Carolina to New Jersey and let her know from newspaper clippings. She received this envelope and the letter back on February 12th, 1942. So just over 2 months after it was sent, she had to deal with the pain of his loss and then would receive a reminder like this. So what I want to talk about in the remaining time is the home front response to Pearl Harbor, what service individuals stationed here in North Carolina experienced, what the families of those experienced, and what people wanted to do to support the country after the Japanese attack. So the North Carolina Office of Civilian Defense had just been started in 1941. The Federal Office of Civilian Defense was founded in May 1941. It took a while to get civilian defense offices up and going. As you can see from these articles from Gastonia Daily Gazette and the Burlington Daily Times, there were questions about getting the State Guard up and going to help with security issues in the state, and the civilian defense going to support home front efforts and observations of airports and things like that. But only about half of the counties in North Carolina had civil defense offices formed for volunteers to volunteer to do work to support the war effort at the time of the Japanese attack. And then people started writing letters. They started writing letters to national politicians, to the president and his wife, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. They wrote to the War Department. They wrote to the North Carolina governor. They wrote to whoever they could write to. Former World War I veterans offered their assistance. This is a letter from World War I veteran Henry L. Myrover of Fayetteville to John Van Bockelen Metz, who was the National Guard Adjutant General at the time and had been Myrover's World War I commander with the 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Division during World War I. Myrover was wounded at the Somme Offensive in September 1918, and he was 61 years old when he wrote this letter offering his service. But he still wanted to help despite his previous service and injuries. This is an interesting letter written to Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, as it's headed, Eleanor Roosevelt, from Charles Swan of Southport, North Carolina. And the interesting thing about this letter is the context in which he writes. And in the letter, it's important to understand that a lot of people didn't have the perspective that federal officials were too busy to respond to people. Before World War II, it was very common to expect major politicians, people who were at a national level, to communicate with the average person in America. And you see a lot of this in these response letters, that the individual is just as important. And it's something that would get lost a little bit with the response to World War II and the buildup of a national war machine, where people were so busy and had difficulty responding. But my favorite quote from this letter is, "As I feel that the president is a very busy man just now, I thought I would write you and ask that you inform the president that I am ready to do anything in my power to assist our country in putting down Japan or any other country that may try to tread on us. I'm an old man, 68 years, a retired lighthouse keeper, served in the Spanish-American War as quartermaster first class on USS Cheyenne, and served in the lighthouse service 39 years and 3 months." And he just thought that Mrs. Roosevelt would be able to get to the president to let her know that he was willing to serve. This letter was sent by the White House back to the state of North Carolina's Office of Civilian Defense. Women began offering their service. There was a push to have student nurses start to contribute to home front care as medical personnel were needed for military service in 1941. Pearl Harbor sped that up, and this letter to the North Carolina Office of Civilian Defense was written and addressed to the Defense Association, because nobody knew the exact name at that time and didn't have an address to send it to. But these 3 student nurses from North Carolina were in Lumberton, North Carolina, when they wrote this letter on December 12, 1941. And they are Virginia Britt, Rosalie Norton, and Carrie Love Coleman. Coleman was from Columbus County. Virginia Noel of Raleigh wrote this letter on December 16, 1941 to New York City Mayor LaGuardia, who was the director of the National Office of Civilian Defense, and then it was forwarded to the North Carolina Office of Civilian Defense, imploring the inclusion of women to be allowed to drill and train for military-style training so that they could serve on the home front. The letter sought women's active inclusion in new volunteer programs for the Office of Civilian Defense, which weren't in place at this point. And as she says here, for the last 20 years, I've done publicity and public relations work, and I know that I could create an enthusiastic army of women who would be willing to do anything and everything possible for this country. And this is before women started working in factories during World War II. African Americans had a tough time in World War II. Obviously, there was a high amount of racism in North Carolina, as recent projects such as the Department of Natural Cultural Resources Green Book Project have illustrated. But there were also fewer opportunities being provided to them, as the resources were provided for their white counterparts to register for the draft, facilities to do so, places, facilities, finances to volunteer for the Office of Civilian Defense, the local Office of Civilian Defense. So at the left, you see a registration day advertisement in High Point from the High Point Enterprise newspaper. There are 4 locations where white individuals can register and only 2 where African Americans can register for the draft. And they could register, but they still weren't being inducted at the same numbers. And then at the right, you see an article from the High Point Enterprise also noting that the Guilford County Office of Civilian Defense was having a volunteer registration program, but they had a separate Black Office of Civilian Defense in the county, and they did it at many counties where they were to register. And they had a smaller location to do so, but this program hadn't really been organized at this point, even though some of the white programs were starting to get pushed very quickly after Pearl Harbor. And then you have those with disabilities who wanted to serve. This is one of the underrepresented aspects of World War II. We focus a lot on injured service individuals for World War II, but those on the home front who had a disability, if you weren't serving your country, if you weren't doing war bonds, if you weren't participating in an effort to support the patriotism of the time and the war programs, you could be made to feel like less of an American. And this is a thing that a lot of people with disabilities did not want to have. This is a letter written to President Franklin Roosevelt that was forwarded to Mrs. Roosevelt and then to the North Carolina Office of Civilian Defense by Lode, or I don't know how to pronounce that, S. Richardson of Furchess in Allegheny County. He had a disability from childhood paralysis and says in the letter that he has not a dollar to his name. But he does offer this to President Roosevelt. I am offering my services wherever they may call me to defeat our enemies. I am not physically able to do the work of some, but there are things I can do and release some able-bodied person to do something else. This is a letter written by a man named Luther A. Pickett of Lexington, North Carolina, to his then girlfriend, later wife, Angeline Calvert, who's from Linwood, North Carolina. And Pickett was stationed at Fort Bragg in the 79th Field Artillery Regiment at the time that Pearl Harbor happened. This letter is from December 11th, 1941, in which he says to Angeline, Angeline, we don't know where we are going or when. The whole outlook on the war has changed. It has changed all the boys. We all have a task which we have to do, and we are ready to do it. And at the bottom right is a photo of Luther and Angeline at what we believe is Fort Bragg around 1941 or 1942. This is a letter from to Lieutenant Colonel David L. Hardy of Granville County, originally and later Durham. He was a World War I veteran who served with the U.S. Army at the time of Pearl Harbor, and he was sent to the Philippines, attached to the headquarters U.S. Army forces in the Far East, to help reorganize the forces there and train the local Philippine people for defense against Japanese attack. He got there in November 1941, and he would be captured as a POW by the Japanese on Bataan in the Philippines, and was involved in the Bataan Death March. He survived the war. And it's important to note that the Japanese also attacked the Philippines at the same time as Pearl Harbor. And this letter was written by Hardy's wife, Elizabeth, on December 10th, 1941, recounting how the family heard about the news and responded to this. How we all are praying for each of you, hoping and believing that no harm will come to any of you. It was an awful shock to us too when we got the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Manila on Sunday, December 7th on the radio at 2:30 p.m. Mary Lucille, who was David's daughter, ran at once to her bed, yours in my room, and aloud pleaded with God to take care of her daddy. He would be captured about 4 months after this letter was written. And then the last letter we're going to show is a letter asking about emergency supplies in the current climate where we're having a global crisis. Similar issues happened after Pearl Harbor. We didn't have enough supplies for civilians for emergencies. This letter from Robert Gerald Boheman of Charlotte to President Roosevelt, and it was forwarded to the U.S. Army Board of Civilian Protection, sought information on how to obtain civilian gas masks. After Pearl Harbor, there was a major fear that the Germans and the Japanese would simply gas civilians in America by air. This was part of the purpose for the Office of Civilian Defense air spotting operations by those on the home front. And we didn't have masks at this time for civilians. We didn't have enough for Army personnel. And then after Pearl Harbor, from 1942 to 1945, Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry for all of the country and North Carolina, as these newsletter issues from North Carolina military installations show after the war The first anniversary on December 7th, 1942, the Pasquotank Patrol, which was the newsletter for the U.S. Naval Air Station at Elizabeth City, had a special edition with the cover showing the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. Pearl Harbor Day also became a major focus for war bond drives each and every year during World War II. As you can see from these articles on the right, Target for Pearl Harbor Day ad in the Cherry Point News from Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in 1943. And then the results of the sale, excuse me, listed here in the following month in January 1944. Pearl Harbor also became the rallying cry for propaganda in the US to avenge the losses we suffered that day. These are two very famous posters, but these particular posters were actually used in North Carolina and now are housed in the military collection at the State Archives in North Carolina. They were issued by the Office of War Information in 1942. And one of the questions we get asked is, why does this still matter? It matters because of the impact it had on our country. It brought us to a state of war and made us realize our vulnerabilities. It brought war to every American, not just those in the military, even more so than World War I. And it also has an impact in that those who still have not been accounted for from Pearl Harbor, as their remains have not been identified, are still being identified by the Defense POW and MIA accounting agency. There are still over 1,100 unaccounted for, unidentified from Pearl Harbor, mainly from Navy vessels. 3 of those who have been in the past 4 years identified: Frank Wood of Franklin, North Carolina, from the USS Oklahoma. He was identified in September 2017. Howard Hodges of Beaufort County from the USS West Virginia was identified in the fall of 2020. And then just recently, Edward E. Talbot of Albemarle was on the USS Oklahoma, and he was not identified till August 2021 and recently interred in November of this year. As you can see from this article, these names still have an impact. The families still remember. Even the second, third generations after the attack still are impacted by these. And it's important on this anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, that we remember the stories and the people and the connections that were lost as a result of the attack. So those are some of my resources, and I'm open for taking questions.
Hello. Yeah, I'll be handling the questions. I do seem to have a sort of inconsistent internet at the moment, so if you'll bear with me if there's any interruptions.
And I just want to shout out real quick to Frank Blassett Jr., who is the head military curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He's on. I see his comment. Thank you, Frank. He's the one who did a lot of the work on David Hardy and his papers, so we could have the quote from that letter.
All right, so going just by the questions in order, what was the original term of service for those drafted prior to Pearl Harbor?
What was that?
The original term of service for those drafted prior to Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. 2 years, typically. I mean, there were a lot of factors. The Marine Corps, it was 2 years. Different branches had different quotas, and it would change pretty rapidly. Just as after World War II, it would change. You'd have 2 years on, 2 years off, 2 years of active service, 2 years of reserve service after World War II, until the Korean War. You had basically 2 years and you were out. It was a limited term of service. We didn't have a large standing army. Our biggest strengths were in the Navy, to be honest, which is why Pearl Harbor attack was such a big hit on our resources.
We have Ron, who asked, how do we get copies of some of these letters? I'm assuming he's asking how does the average person get a copy of letters?
Yeah, I mean, so these are all state archives and we're open to the public. These particular letters are in the Office of Civilian Defense records. There's a finding. The collection was processed in the 1960s and then reorganized through the 1990s to 2010s by my predecessors. They're not described to this level. These particular ones are in a folder called Volunteers, dated 1941. That's in the Office of Civilian Defense records. But any of these letters can be ordered. You can get scans of these from our reference unit. They will ask me if you want a specific letter. I'll tell them where it's at. We have the citations. You can come to the archives, do research in this. Burleson's materials, more of them are scanned and online. We've done past blog posts for previous anniversaries on him. There's an NCPD article that I wrote that is online for him. So there's more details about his story because it's very interesting. But yeah, all this stuff has been we've had these things since 1947. And part of the point of doing programs like this is to let you know these are around. So they're here for you and you can get them.
Adrienne asks about Elsie. Do you know why she was in New Jersey and how? Please share how the letters made their way into the archive.
We have a very small collection. It was a survival item that the donor purchased because it was being sold and donated to us, which happens a lot with the military records, even for people like Pearl Harbor survivors, which is really annoying to someone in my profession who's trying to save this history for the public. This particular set, we have a postcard and a letter written by Burleson himself. One in August, one in November of 1941. Then we have Elsie's letter in the envelope, and then we have a couple of newspaper clippings, and that's it. Everything else, I had to do a lot of research on them. There's very little detail on him after his Marine Corps service. All we have is from what's in his letters about where he's at. Elsie got married, and her husband moved to New Jersey. And when we know this from the information referenced in the letters, that we do have, that when Burleson was stationed with the Marine Corps, I think he was in Washington, D.C., he and Elsie would visit. Elsie and her husband would come and visit him, and that's how they stayed in touch. But we know from school yearbooks and from census records that they were childhood friends.
Nancy asked to describe the capacity of radar at the time and when were they aware that there were planes coming from Japan?
So there's a lot that has been done on this at the national level. The Library of Congress has bits on this, the National Archives. I tell people I'm not a military historian. I'm an archivist who works with military papers and veterans papers. So it's a question that I don't have that particular answer. I know Frank can answer it, but I mean, there was radar and there was spotting. Something I cut out of the piece for time is that a Japanese sub had been sunk at around 6:40, 6:50 in the morning, right of the attack, and then reported. I don't know what happened to that, but there were indicators. People thought there were planes spotted on radar, but at the time, and this is well reported, that people thought that it was U.S. Army Air Corps or naval aircraft out for a training mission. There was really poor communication at the time, and also Americans didn't expect the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. That's why it became such a shock.
We have still plenty of time for questions, just in case anyone wants to ask some more for the last 10 minutes.
And Terry, I see your point. Yes, one of the oldest living survivors of Pearl Harbor, but he's not a North Carolina native. He lives in North Carolina now. But the point of this was people who were in or from North Carolina at the time of the attacks. That's the focus of it, so that there was a connection at the time. But there's been many more Pearl Harbor survivors that moved to North Carolina or who were stationed in North Carolina and then came to live here after their service. But mainly the names we wanted to focus on were from the time period. And I have this PowerPoint. We can save it as a PDF. It's quite a large file for the images, but we can definitely make this available through the museum if you're interested. But some of these, the things that we featured in this talk today are, I've done 5 blog posts for the past week for the NC Stories of Service blog that the North Carolina Department of Natural Cultural Resources does, that I edit for. It has more detailed stories about some of these letters and context for the markings on them. That's what I do. I explain what things mean, what the little postmarks, all this stuff is. And you can learn more about that there and about some of the people too.
Do you have any information on the National Carbon Company in Winston-Salem that produced the submarine batteries? Pardon me.
If I don't have the records, I'm not going, I'm not going to research that thing, because I have 50 collections in my office. I'm trying to organize, describe archival collections from veterans and the home front. That's not a question that I'm going to get into. That's for historians who are at universities and scholars to do. So unfortunately, that's not something that I have. If we have records on it, it's going to be in the Office of Defense Records, but most of the time, wartime production records are with the National Archives because they had to report their federal production stats to the War Department.
Matthew, we have a question here from an attendee, Ben, and his father was not at Pearl Harbor, but was a draftee. And he's curious about how to find out information about what he was later stationed at Bragg. But he was curious how he might go about finding out what ship his father was on during the cleanup effort after Pearl Harbor. Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I mean, what I tell people is with military records, World War I, there's a lot of stuff out there. It's been well written. It's no longer restricted. There's no longer aspects of the war that's restricted. And it's kind of easy to find history and service information for that war. World War II is tough. I mean, unless you have the person's papers or letters, like what we get in, where you can piece together histories or photos that have like locations and dates written on the back. If you have to comb through a lot of records at the National Archives. And what you would do is you would go to the units or the record series that had to deal with that event or program. So the cleanup efforts are in a specific record series at the National Archives, and then you'd have to go through that and go by ship list and then find a name. There's no other way to do it. That's the way that I would have to do it. That's the way anybody has to do it, unless you have the records jacket from their service history that lists dates and names. That stuff's not widely available. There's so many military records that it's just not that easy to do. We can get records up to the time that someone's drafted. We can get if they were enlisted for the most part, except for the Navy and even the Coast Guard. Coast Guard's harder. But where people were stationed, what they were doing, unless we know it from their stuff, which is why it's important to save their stuff and donate their stuff to an archives. If we don't have that, it's really tough to put together. You're not going to be able to go on Ancestry or Fold3 and find those records. And yeah, I mean, I can, John Ramsey, I see your point. I can talk to anybody. I can do virtual program. Anybody wants to have me in, that's not a problem. People can contact us if they want me to talk about things in our collection, and this talk's already done. So yeah.
Matthew, is it okay for me to put your email address in the chat so they know how to get in touch with you?
Yeah, and that is, I had it at the start, but let me grab it real quick. And did you get it, Stacy? Okay.
Yes, I've got your name
Okay.
and your email address. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, and we have the military collection has a website on the State Archives under collections. You can find out more. There's a contact information. We have over 12,000 photos from different war periods, over 6,500 from World War II on our Flickr page, organized by albums. We have a World War II digital collection. The newsletters that you saw from the military installations, we digitized all of those that we've had since World War II. You can read these yourself. We've been trying to get these things online and promote them more. It just takes a lot of time. So we hope you enjoyed the information you saw and get a sense of what people were experiencing in the month after the attack.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And guys, I put the link to the blog that Matthew referred to a couple of times in the chat as well. So you can feel free to go visit that if you would like to learn more information.
And Terry, real quick, we run the State Veterans Oral History program collection. We have over 1,160 interviews. A lot of those are analog that we did from 96 to 2014. We've been doing new ones ever since. If people contact us, there's a submission form on our website that details about the program and what the interview process is like. And we do have some of these interviews online. So yes.
So many messages of thanks, Matthew. And I would also like to say thank you so much for taking time today to share these incredible pieces of history with us and for all of your hard work to preserve them. It's really, really incredible.
Well, thanks. It's a team effort. It's people collected this during World War II, or we wouldn't have these things. So for past and present, I thank all those people who have.
And thank you to all those of you who joined us today. We hope that you'll join us for our next History at High Noon, celebrating piracy. Really? With ECU's Dr. Charlie Ewan, happening on January 12th, 2022. In the meantime, we wish all of you a safe, happy, and healthy holiday season, and we will see you next year. Take care, everybody. Bye.